Bond. James Bond.
Everything you thought you knew about James Bond wasn't the full story. Behind the smooth tuxedo, the shaken martinis, and the high-tech gadgets hides a character filled with shocking secrets, hidden truths, and dark twists that even die-hard fans never saw coming. From his creation on paper to his dangerous life on screen, 007's story is far more surprising than Hollywood ever let on. Get ready, because these aren't your typical spy facts. These are the 10 most jaw-dropping truths about James Bond that will change the way you see him forever.
Well, that's all. Thank you, sir.
10. James Bond was based on real spies. The truth about James Bond is far more shocking than most fans realize. When Ian Fleming introduced 007 to the world in 1953 with Casino Royale, he wasn't creating a spy entirely from imagination. Fleming himself had served in British naval intelligence during World War II, where he was exposed to top-secret missions, dangerous agents, and the constant tension of espionage. These experiences left a deep mark on him, and instead of inventing Bond from scratch, he built the character by borrowing qualities from the real-life operatives he had met and admired. Fleming had watched agents who carried themselves with calm confidence in public, but operated with cold ruthlessness in private. He knew men who used charm like a weapon, slipping into high society parties to gather information, then disappearing into the shadows when danger struck. He also knew soldiers who relied on experimental gadgets, clever disguises, and risky tactics that mirrored what Bond would later use on screen. Even Bond's cool detachment and willingness to kill reflected the hardened reality of those who risked their lives daily in the war. What makes this truth so shocking is how directly it connects 007 to reality. Fleming once admitted Bond was a mixture of different figures, a cocktail of spies, commandos, and adventurers he had encountered. That blend of real danger and stylized drama is what gave Bond his authenticity. He wasn't a superhero, he was a reflection of the very real shadows of World War II. Knowing this changes how you see Bond forever. He wasn't just a fictional icon, he was a mirror of actual men who lived and died in secrecy.
I was referring to the original vintage, 1851. Unmistakable.
9. The name James Bond came from a bird book. Another shocking truth about 007 is that the world's most famous spy has a name born not from espionage or glamour, but from birdwatching. Ian Fleming, who lived in Jamaica, was an avid bird enthusiast. On his shelf sat a book called Birds of the West Indies, written by an American ornithologist named James Bond. Fleming admired the simplicity of the name. It was plain, direct, and almost painfully ordinary. That's exactly why he chose it. Fleming didn't want his hero saddled with a flashy, unrealistic name like Rex Thunder or Jack Strong. He wanted something neutral, a name that felt real enough to belong to any ordinary man, but strong enough to let the character's actions create the legend. In Fleming's own words, James Bond was the dullest name he had ever heard, and that dullness made it perfect. By giving his extraordinary spy such an ordinary name, Fleming created a contrast that made 007 stand out even more. The irony is almost unbelievable. A name lifted casually from a bird book went on to define one of the most iconic characters in film and literature. What started as a throwaway choice became a symbol of elegance, danger, and sophistication. Over decades, James Bond became more than a character. He became an identity recognized across the globe, all from a simple name meant to be forgettable. This twist proves that greatness sometimes rises from the most unexpected sources, and the spy with the plainest name became the world's most unforgettable secret agent. 8. 007 was nearly called something else. It's hard to imagine James Bond being called anything other than 007, but the shocking truth is that Ian Fleming nearly went in a very different direction. During the early drafts of his novels, Fleming toyed with various names and numbers for his spy character. His goal was to create someone who looked believable on paper, someone who didn't sound like a superhero or a cartoon figure. But the number and identity he settled on 007 wasn't random. It was actually inspired by real British intelligence codes used during World War II. The 00 prefix symbolized an agent with a license to kill, meaning this character had the authority to eliminate enemies without hesitation if the mission required it. Fleming wanted a number that would feel mysterious and memorable, yet also grounded in the real espionage culture he had known personally. The choice of 7 gave it a sharp, punchy identity that was easy to remember. But for a while, Fleming considered other combinations, and the character could have carried a very different code designation altogether. Even more surprising, Bond himself could have had an entirely different first name if Fleming hadn't discovered James Bond in that bird book. He considered flashier, dramatic names early on before rejecting them in favor of something plain. Looking back now, it feels impossible to think of the spy as anyone else. But this truth reveals how close the world came to knowing 007 under a different identity, one that might not have carried the same timeless weight. The Bond we know today was shaped by small but crucial choices, and had Fleming chosen differently, cinema's greatest spy might have been unrecognizable. 7. Bond's first film wasn't Dr. No. Most fans believe the James Bond movie franchise began in 1962 with Sean Connery's Dr. No, but the shocking truth is that Bond's first on-screen appearance happened years earlier and in a very unexpected way. In 1954, CBS produced a live television adaptation of Casino Royale as part of its anthology series, Climax. Instead of a British secret agent, this version turned Bond into an American spy, played by actor Barry Nelson. Even the name Jimmy Bond was used, which feels almost unthinkable today. The show was a one-hour special, performed live, and while it introduced some of the characters and settings fans later recognized, it lacked the style and charm that defined the official films. Most viewers today don't even know it exists, and for decades, it was nearly forgotten in the shadow of the big-screen Bond phenomenon. But this little-known production technically marked Bond's first screen debut, long before Connery donned the tuxedo. What makes this even more fascinating is how different Bond could have looked if that version had become popular. Imagine if the Americanized Jimmy Bond had been the version audiences embraced. 007 might never have developed into the cool, distinctly British icon that fans around the world came to adore. Thankfully, Dr. No redefined the franchise and set the standard for what James Bond should be, but this hidden history proves that the world's most famous spy started his cinematic journey in a way that feels almost alien compared to the legend we know today. 6. Bond almost died on screen permanently. One of the most shocking truths about James Bond is that the character's survival wasn't always guaranteed. Behind the glamorous tuxedos and thrilling escapes, there were moments when producers and writers considered ending his story once and for all. In fact, during the early stages of the franchise, some drafts explored the idea of killing off Bond permanently as a dramatic twist. The thought was that his death would cement him as a tragic hero, a man who lived recklessly and ultimately paid the price for his dangerous life. This idea wasn't just a creative experiment, it reflected real fears that the franchise might lose momentum. In the 1960s and 70s, Bond films were immensely popular, but some critics claimed the character was too formulaic and would eventually fade out. To prevent stagnation, drastic changes were considered. A shocking death on screen could have created headlines, sparked massive public debate, and ensured Bond went down in history with finality. But the producers ultimately realized Bond was too valuable to kill. The world had fallen in love with the suave spy, and audiences weren't ready to let him go. Instead of ending him, they found creative ways to reinvent him. Different actors stepped into the role, bringing fresh energy while keeping the essence intact. Bond's survival became more than just a plot choice, it became a symbol of resilience. He could take a beating, face impossible odds, and still emerge alive. This truth proves how close the world came to losing cinema's greatest spy forever, and how a single decision shaped decades of storytelling. 5. Ian Fleming didn't want Sean Connery as Bond. It's hard to imagine anyone other than Sean Connery defining James Bond, yet the shocking truth is that Ian Fleming himself initially rejected him. When producers cast Connery for Dr. No, Fleming was less than impressed. He felt Connery was too rough, too unpolished, and lacking the refined sophistication he had envisioned for his suave British agent. In Fleming's mind, Bond was closer to the aristocratic gentlemen he had met in high society, men with quiet charm, tailored manners, and smooth voices. Connery, with his working-class background and rugged appearance, didn't fit the picture. But Connery had something Fleming didn't anticipate: raw charisma. Once the cameras rolled, Connery's version of Bond combined toughness with elegance in a way no one had ever seen before. He could deliver witty lines with a smirk, seduce with a glance, and fight with brutal efficiency. Audiences loved it, and soon, so did Fleming. In fact, after seeing Connery's performance, Fleming began adjusting Bond in his later novels, giving the character Scottish roots that mirrored Connery's heritage. This transformation is remarkable. The actor Fleming once doubted, but became the very face of Bond, and his influence continues to shape the role to this day. Every actor who followed from Roger Moore to Daniel Craig has carried echoes of Connery's balance between sophistication and danger. What began as hesitation turned into cinematic history. This shocking truth proves that even the creator of 007 couldn't foresee the power Connery would bring to the role, and without him, James Bond might never have become the cultural giant he is today. 4. Bond's signature martini line was a mistake. Shaken, not stirred. It's one of the most iconic catchphrases in movie history, instantly tied to James Bond. But the shocking truth is that this line wasn't originally planned to become his signature. In fact, it began almost as an accident. In Ian Fleming's novels, Bond does drink martinis, but the emphasis on how he prefers them wasn't a major point. The focus came later, when filmmakers wanted to highlight Bond's refined tastes and subtle quirks to make him stand out from other action heroes. The phrase first appeared in Dr. No, and it was delivered with casual elegance, not as a bold statement. Nobody at the time could have guessed it would catch fire with audiences, but it did, and suddenly the line became part of Bond's identity. What was meant as a small detail turned into a cultural phenomenon, quoted endlessly by fans and even parodied in comedies and advertisements around the world. The irony is that real cocktail experts have often pointed out that the order makes little sense. A martini is traditionally stirred, not shaken, because shaking clouds the drink and dilutes it. But that mistake became Bond's signature. It made him look like a man who did things his own way, someone who could break tradition and still look effortlessly cool. That's the real genius of it. The wrong choice turned into the perfect symbol for a character who always stood apart from the crowd. This shocking truth proves that even accidents can create legends. 3. A real MI6 agent once criticized Bond. While fans around the world celebrate James Bond as the ultimate spy, real intelligence agents haven't always been impressed. In fact, one of the most shocking truths is that actual MI6 operatives have publicly criticized Bond, calling him reckless, unrealistic, and even dangerous as a role model. To those who lived in the real world of espionage, Bond wasn't a hero, he was a fantasy that got nearly everything wrong. Real spies pointed out that Bond's constant reliance on flashy gadgets, loud car chases, and high-profile shootouts went against the very principles of espionage. The real work of intelligence gathering was about patience, subtlety, and blending into the background. Bond, by contrast, attracted attention everywhere he went, leaving destruction in his wake. Some agents even joked that if Bond truly existed, his career would have lasted only a few weeks before his cover was blown. But this criticism actually highlights why Bond became so iconic. Fleming never intended 007 to be a perfect reflection of reality. Instead, he took the foundation of real spies he had known and exaggerated them for dramatic effect. Bond was meant to be larger than life, a figure who entertained as much as he inspired. Yet the criticism from MI6 proves just how powerful Bond's image has become. He blurred the line between fiction and reality so effectively that even professional spies felt the need to set the record straight. This truth reveals that Bond may not be a realistic spy, but he is the most unforgettable one the world has ever known. 2. Bond nearly lost his license to kill. One of the most shocking truths about James Bond is that his license to kill, the very thing that defines him as 007, was almost taken away, not in the story, but in the real world. During the 1980s and 90s, growing political and cultural pressure painted Bond as outdated, sexist, and excessively violent. Critics began questioning whether a character built on cold-blooded assassinations and womanizing could still represent modern audiences. For a while, there were serious talks within the franchise about softening Bond, removing his more lethal side, or even ending the series altogether. In the political climate of the time, studios worried that a spy who killed so casually would spark controversy. Some writers floated the idea of reinventing Bond into a more diplomatic figure, someone who relied less on bullets and more on clever negotiations. But stripping away his license to kill would have meant erasing the core of his identity. Bond without lethal authority isn't Bond at all. he becomes just another action hero. What saved the franchise was its ability to adapt while keeping Bond's edge intact. Later films reimagined him as a more complex figure, exploring the psychological weight of his choices. Instead of glorifying the violence, they showed the cost of being licensed to kill. This allowed Bond to survive in a modern world without losing what made him unique. The fact that 007 came close to being disarmed forever proves how fragile his cinematic identity once was, and how easily we might have lost the spy who redefined danger. 1. The Bond identity may not be a person, but a code name. The most shocking truth of all is tied to a fan theory that has grown stronger over the decades. James Bond might not be one man at all. Instead, the name James Bond could be a code name, passed down from agent to agent, along with the famous 007 designation. This theory emerged because the franchise has lasted more than 60 years, with multiple actors playing Bond without the character ever aging. From Sean Connery to Daniel Craig, Bond remains eternally in his prime, even though the timeline of his adventures stretches far beyond a normal lifespan. Supporters of the theory point to subtle clues. Each Bond has a slightly different personality, style, and way of handling missions. Some films even hint at Bond's past inconsistencies, almost as if acknowledging he isn't one continuous man, but rather a role that is assumed by different operatives. If true, it explains why 007 never grows old, why the women and villains constantly change, and why Bond can adapt to each new era so seamlessly. The producers have never officially confirmed this theory, but they've never completely denied it either. That silence fuels the mystery, making Bond's identity even more intriguing. Whether you believe he is one immortal spy or a series of agents stepping into the same legend, the truth remains that James Bond is larger than any single person. He is an idea, danger, style, charm, and lethal authority wrapped into one name. That's what makes 007 timeless, and why the world's most famous spy continues to thrill audiences after all these years. From real-life spies shaping his character to shocking twists that nearly erased him from history, James Bond has always been more than just a movie hero. He's a cultural icon wrapped in mystery, reinvention, and hidden truths. But here's the real question. After learning all this, do you see Bond as a single man, or as an unbreakable legend that no one can truly kill? If you loved uncovering these secrets, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with other Bond fans who think they already know everything about 007. Because the truth is, when it comes to James Bond, there's always another secret waiting to be revealed.